The winter of 1937 came early to the mountains of northern Montana, and it came with a cruelty that seemed almost personal. 16-year-old Eliza Whitmore stood at the edge of her uncle's property, a flour sack containing everything she owned clutched in one hand, her 12-year-old sister, Rosemary's small fingers gripping the other. The wind cut through their thin coats like knives made of ice, and behind them, the yellow light from the farmhouse windows, the only home they had known since their parents died of influenza 3 years ago, went dark, one by one. "Don't come back," Uncle Vernon had said, his voice flat as the frozen ground. "I've got my own children to feed. Your aunt's sick. There's nothing here for you anymore." Eliza had not cried. She had learned in those 3 years of living on the thin edge of her relatives' tolerance that tears changed nothing. Instead, she had gathered what little they possessed: 2 changes of clothes each, their mother's Bible, their father's hunting knife, a book on botany that had been her mother's most treasured possession, and the 47 cents she had saved from selling wildflower bouquets in the summer, and she had taken her sister's hand and walked out into the gathering darkness. Rosemary was crying, her small body shaking with sobs that she tried to muffle against Eliza's coat. "Where will we go?" she whispered. "Eliza, where will we go?" Eliza pulled her sister closer, feeling the trembling that had nothing to do with the cold. "Somewhere," she said, her voice steady even as her heart raced with fear. "Somewhere they can't send us away from." The town of Miller's Creek lay 7 miles east, but Eliza knew what awaited them there. The orphanage, with its iron beds and thin blankets and matrons who saw children as problems to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. The workhouses that would separate her from Rosemary, sending one sister to a farm in the valley and another to a household in town, where they would scrub floors and empty chamber pots and slowly forget each other's faces. She had seen it happen to other children, watched families dissolve like sugar in hot water, and she had sworn on her mother's grave that she would never let it happen to them. So instead of walking east toward the lights of town, Eliza turned west, toward the mountains that rose like dark giants against the evening sky, toward the wilderness that had swallowed better men than her, toward what everyone said was certain death. But Eliza Whitmore had a secret, and that secret was about to save both their lives. If you want to find out how 2 abandoned sisters survived a Montana winter and built something that would feed families for generations, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Eliza and Rosemary created in those frozen mountains wasn't just shelter. It was a miracle that people still talk about today. The Whitmore sisters had not always been orphans, had not always been the unwanted burden that relatives passed between themselves like a debt no one wanted to pay. Once, they had been loved. Once, they had been the center of a small but warm universe. Their father, Thomas Whitmore, had been a surveyor for the Montana Geological Society, a man who spent his days mapping the hidden contours of the earth. He would come home with his boots caked in mud and his pockets full of rocks that he would spread across the kitchen table, explaining to his daughters the stories written in stone. "The earth has secrets," he would say, his eyes bright with the joy of discovery. "And if you learn to read them, she'll share them with you." Their mother, Margaret, had been a teacher before her marriage, a woman who believed that knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken from you. She had taught both daughters to read before they could properly tie their shoes, had filled their small cabin with books borrowed from the library in Helena, had shown them how to identify plants in the woods behind their home. "Nature provides," she would tell them as they gathered mushrooms and berries, "if you know where to look." Eliza had inherited her father's curiosity and her mother's love of learning, She had been the strange child who preferred books to dolls, who asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, who wandered in the woods when other girls were learning to sew and cook. At school, the other children had called her Odd Eliza and the weird Whitmore girl. But she had not minded. She had her family, and that was enough. Then the influenza came. It swept through Montana in the autumn of 1934, killing without mercy or reason. Thomas went first, his strong surveyor's body failing within a week. Margaret held on longer, as if by sheer will she could stay to protect her daughters, but by the time the first snow fell, she too was gone. Eliza, 13 years old and suddenly responsible for a 9-year-old sister, had stood at their graveside and made a promise that no one heard. She would keep Rosemary safe, no matter what it cost. The cost, as it turned out, was 3 years of labor and humiliation at her uncle's farm. 3 years of being reminded daily that she and Rosemary were mouths to feed, hands to work, problems to be solved. 3 years of watching her sister grow thin and quiet, the light slowly fading from eyes that had once sparkled with curiosity. 3 years of dreaming about escape, while knowing that escape meant death in the wilderness that surrounded them. But Eliza had used those 3 years well. She had read every book she could find, including the geological surveys her father had left behind. She had memorized the maps he had drawn, the notes he had made about the landscape he had spent his life studying. And she had learned a secret about a place high in the mountains that no one else seemed to know about. Her father's notes spoke of hot springs, not the famous ones that tourists visited, but a hidden system of thermal vents deep in the backcountry, where hot water rose from the earth year-round. He had written about an abandoned homestead nearby, built 50 years earlier by a prospector who had died without heirs. He had noted that the ground near the springs never froze, that steam rose from fissures in the rock even in the coldest months, that the thermal heat created a microclimate where plants grew that shouldn't survive at that altitude. For 3 years, Eliza had studied those notes. She had memorized the route, up Sullivan Creek, through the notch in the ridge, along the old mining trail that no one used anymore. She had calculated distances, estimated travel times, imagined what they would find when they arrived. She had planned and waited and hoped she would never have to use what she had learned. Now, with her uncle's door closed behind her and winter closing in around them, the time for waiting was over. The first night was the hardest. They walked until darkness made walking dangerous, then huddled together in a hollow beneath a fallen tree, sharing body heat and fear in equal measure. Rosemary cried herself to sleep while Eliza lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the trees and praying that the wolves she heard in the distance would not find their scent. By morning, frost had formed on their blankets, and Eliza's fingers were so numb she could barely grip the knife she used to cut strips of bark from a willow tree. She remembered her mother teaching her about willow bark, how it contained a natural medicine that could ease pain and reduce fever. She made Rosemary chew a piece, then chewed one herself, and they pressed on. The second day brought snow, not the gentle flurries of early autumn, but a serious storm that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. Eliza navigated by instinct and memory, following the creek her father had described, looking for the landmarks he had noted in his surveys. Twice they had to backtrack when the way became impassable. Once, crossing a frozen stream, Rosemary broke through the ice and plunged into water up to her knees. They had to stop and build a small fire, risking discovery for the sake of preventing frostbite. By the third day, their food was gone, and Rosemary had developed a cough that worried Eliza more than she let show. They were climbing now, gaining elevation with every laborious step, and the air grew thinner, even as the cold grew more intense. Eliza found herself calculating their chances, the remaining distance, the rate of their progress, the amount of energy they had left, and not liking the numbers she came up with. Then, on the morning of the fourth day, she saw the steam. It rose from the valley below them, like breath from the earth itself, white plumes curling against the gray sky. The snow, which had buried everything in white for the past 2 days, stopped abruptly at the valley's edge, giving way to bare ground and the brown-green of plants that should have been dead or dormant. The air, which had been cold enough to freeze tears on cheeks, carried a faint warmth and a mineral smell like eggs. "Eliza," Rosemary whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. "What is this place?" "Home," Eliza said. "This is going to be our home." The valley was perhaps 200 yards across, nestled in a fold of the mountains that protected it from the worst of the wind. At its center, a pool of water steamed gently, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror made of mist. Around the pool, the ground was warm to the touch. Eliza tested it with her palm and felt heat radiating up through the soil. Smaller vents dotted the landscape, some releasing thin streams of steam, others simply warming the air around them. And there, at the far end of the valley, stood the cabin. It was small, perhaps 15 feet square, and it had seen better days. The roof sagged in the middle, and one wall had partially collapsed, but the logs that formed its frame were still solid, and the stone foundation, built directly over a thermal vent, was intact. The prospector who had built this place 50 years ago had known what he was doing. He had positioned the cabin to capture the natural heat of the earth, creating a dwelling that would stay warm even when the world outside turned to ice. Eliza spent the next hour exploring while Rosemary rested by the warm pool, her cough slowly easing in the mineral-rich steam. The cabin was a ruin, yes, but a ruin that could be rebuilt. The old prospector had left behind tools, a rusted axe, a saw with a broken handle, a shovel that still held its edge. There was a root cellar dug into the warm earth, empty now but still intact. There were the remnants of a garden, its stone borders still visible beneath the overgrown vegetation, and there, incredibly, were plants still growing in the thermal warmth. Eliza recognized some from her mother's lessons: watercress in the shallows of the warm stream, wild onions in the moist soil near the vents, rose hips still clinging to bushes that should have been bare. It wasn't much, but it was food. It was survival. That first week nearly killed them anyway. Despite the thermal warmth, the nights were brutally cold, and the cabin's holes let in drafts that stole heat faster than the ground could provide it. They ate what they could find: watercress and wild onions, rose hips boiled into bitter tea, grubs dug from rotting logs. Rosemary's cough worsened before it got better, and there were 2 nights when Eliza sat up until dawn, watching her sister breathe, terrified each exhale would be the last. But they did not die. And as the first week became the second, and the second became the third, Eliza began to understand what they had found. This valley wasn't just warm, it was a bubble of different rules, a place where the normal constraints of winter did not apply. The thermal vents created zones of varying temperature, from near freezing at the valley's edges to almost tropical near the central springs. The mineral-rich water deposited nutrients in the soil. The consistent warmth meant that with the right planning, plants could grow here year-round. Eliza's mind, trained by years of reading and a natural gift for seeing patterns, began to race with possibilities. The first project was the cabin. Using the rusted tools and logs scavenged from the surrounding forest, Eliza rebuilt the collapsed wall and patched the sagging roof. She discovered that by positioning stones heated by the thermal vents inside the cabin, she could store warmth that radiated through the night. She dug channels that directed warm air from the ground beneath the foundation, up through gaps in the floorboards. By the end of the first month, the cabin was snug enough that they could sleep without piling every scrap of cloth they owned on top of themselves. The second project was food. Eliza knew they couldn't survive the winter on wild onions and rose hips, and the 47 cents she had saved wouldn't buy enough provisions to matter. But she had her father's surveying knowledge, her mother's botanical education, and a mind that refused to accept the impossible. She began experimenting with the warm zones, planting seeds she gathered from the wild plants that grew near the springs, testing which areas stayed warm enough for growth, which received enough light, which had the right kind of soil. Her first attempts failed. Seeds rotted in soil that was too wet, or baked in ground that was too warm, or simply refused to sprout in the thin mountain air. But Eliza kept notes, just as her father had kept notes on his surveys, recording what worked and what didn't, adjusting her methods, learning from every failure. By December, she had managed to grow a small patch of greens in a sheltered corner where warm air rose from a vent. By January, she had expanded to 3 patches, producing enough to supplement their diet of foraged food and the rabbits Rosemary had learned to trap. It was not enough. They were still hungry, still cold, still balanced on the thin edge of survival. But they were alive, and they were learning, and with every passing week, their situation improved. Then, in February, they received their first visitor. His name was Samuel Crowfeather, and he was 83 years old. A member of the Blackfeet Nation, he had lived in these mountains his entire life, hunting and trapping along routes his ancestors had used for generations. He had known the old prospector who built the cabin, had traded furs with him in the years before his death, and had watched from a distance as the homestead fell into ruin. "Saw your smoke," he said, standing at the edge of the valley with a rifle cradled in his arms and a pack on his back that seemed too heavy for his thin frame. "Thought I'd see who was foolish enough to try living up here." Eliza, who had grabbed her father's knife at the first sign of approach, stood her ground in front of the cabin door, Rosemary hidden inside. "We're not foolish," she said. "We're careful, and this is our home now." Samuel studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "Saw your gardens," he said. "Clever, using the warm spots. My grandmother did something similar, long time ago, before the settlers came." He unslung his pack and set it on the ground. "Brought you some things, flour, salt, some dried venison. Figured anyone smart enough to grow food in February might be worth keeping alive." That pack, and the friendship that came with it, changed everything. Samuel came back every few weeks through that first winter, bringing supplies they couldn't produce themselves, and knowledge that no book could have taught. He showed Eliza how to read the weather in the clouds, how to predict the severity of coming storms by watching animal behavior, how to preserve meat in the cold months and protect food stores from bears and wolverines. He taught Rosemary to set snares that actually caught something, to skin and tan hides, to make moccasins that kept feet warm when boots wore through. But his most important gift was understanding of the thermal springs themselves. His people had known about this place for centuries, had used it for healing and ceremony, had developed techniques for working with its unique properties that European settlers had never learned. He showed Eliza how to channel warm water to create heated growing beds, how to use the steam to extend the growing season even further how to position structures to maximize thermal gain while minimizing heat loss. By the time the snow melted in the spring of 1938, Eliza had a plan. Not just for survival, but for something more. She was going to build a farm in the mountains, a place where food could grow year-round, where the earth's heat would replace the labor of 100 workers. She was going to prove that the girl Miller's Creek had thrown away was worth more than they had ever imagined. That summer, she began construction on the first greenhouse. It was a simple structure, a wooden frame covered with salvaged window glass, positioned directly over a thermal vent, but it represented something revolutionary. Inside, the temperature never dropped below 50 degrees, even on the coldest nights. Eliza planted tomatoes, peppers, and beans, crops that shouldn't have survived at this altitude, and watched them flourish in the consistent warmth. She built channels that carried warm water from the springs to raised beds, heating the soil from below. She constructed a system of vents and baffles that captured rising steam and directed it where it was needed. She experimented with different soil mixtures, learning which combinations worked best with the mineral-rich water that bubbled up from the earth. Rosemary, meanwhile, had found her own calling. The 12-year-old who had arrived in the valley sick and frightened had transformed into a capable young woman who could track game through fresh snow and bring down a deer at 100 yards with a rifle Samuel had given her. She took charge of the animals they gradually accumulated, chickens at first, then goats, then a milk cow that Samuel helped them buy from a rancher in the valley below. The livestock provided eggs and milk and cheese, adding protein and fat to a diet that had once been barely adequate. By the end of their second year in the valley, the Whitmore sisters were not just surviving, they were thriving. Their root cellar was full. Their greenhouse produced vegetables in every month of the year. Their cabin had expanded to include a proper kitchen, a sleeping loft, and a small library of books they had accumulated through trade and gift. And word of what they had built had begun to spread. The first to come was a widow named Hannah Reeves, whose husband had died in a mining accident and whose children were starving on a farm that couldn't support them. She had heard rumors of two sisters growing food in the mountains, and she arrived on foot in the autumn of 1939, her 3 children trailing behind her like ducklings, all of them thin and hollow-eyed with hunger. Eliza looked at those hungry children and saw herself and Rosemary 3 years earlier. She looked at Hannah and saw a woman who had lost everything but refused to give up. She looked at the valley around her, the warm pools, the steam vents, the fertile ground that had saved her life, and she made a decision. "There's a flat spot on the south slope," she said, "warm enough for a cabin, close enough to the springs for a garden. You can build there if you're willing to work." Hannah Reeves was willing. So was her neighbor's son, who came the next spring, fleeing a stepfather who beat him. So was the old Swedish couple whose farm had failed in the drought of 1940. So were a dozen other families over the next 5 years, people who had been chewed up and spit out by an economy that had no use for them, who found their way to a hidden valley where a young woman was building something that seemed impossible. By 1943, the valley had become a community. 12 cabins clustered around the thermal springs, each one positioned to capture the Earth's warmth. A network of greenhouses and heated beds produced vegetables year-round. Tomatoes in January, peppers in February, greens that never stopped growing. The residents had developed their own system of water distribution, their own methods of storage and preservation, their own techniques for maximizing the gifts of the geothermal features that made their lives possible. And then came the winter of 1944, the coldest in living memory, when temperatures in Miller's Creek dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for 3 weeks. Livestock froze in their barns. Pipes burst throughout the town. Food ran short as roads became impassable and supply chains collapsed. In the thermal valley, the temperature never dropped below 20 degrees. The greenhouses kept producing. The animals stayed warm in their geothermally heated barns. And when desperate townspeople finally made the difficult trek up the mountain, hoping to buy or beg food from the strange community they had heard about, they found Eliza Whitmore waiting for them. Among those townspeople was Vernon Whitmore, the uncle who had thrown his nieces out into the snow 7 years earlier. He didn't recognize her at first. The scrawny, frightened 16-year-old he had dismissed had become a woman of 23, strong and confident, her hands calloused from work and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She stood at the edge of the valley as he approached, a rifle comfortable in her hands, flanked by the community she had built from nothing. "We need food," Vernon said, his voice hoarse, his pride clearly struggling with the necessity of asking. "The children are starving. We can pay." "I know who you are, Uncle Vernon," Eliza said quietly. She watched the recognition dawn in his eyes, watched the blood drain from his face, watched him struggle to find words for a situation he had never imagined. "Eliza," he finally managed. We thought you were dead. Both of you. You thought we would die," Eliza said. "You sent 2 children into the winter, and you thought we would die, and that would solve your problem." She let the words hang in the cold air for a moment, then lowered her rifle. "Take what you need. We have enough to share." Vernon stared at her, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. "How can you, after what I did?" "Because the children in Miller's Creek didn't throw us out," Eliza said. "They don't deserve to starve for your choices. And because holding on to anger would only poison me." She gestured toward the warmth of the valley behind her. "Come. Get warm. Eat. Then we'll load up your wagon with whatever you can carry back." That winter, the Thermal Valley community provided food to over 200 people from Miller's Creek and the surrounding farms. They asked for nothing in return. Eliza insisted on that, though many families sent gifts and supplies once the roads opened again. The story of the 2 orphan girls who had built an impossible farm spread throughout Montana and beyond, and reporters from Helena and Butte came to write articles about the geothermal miracle in the mountains. Vernon Whitmore came back one more time, in the spring, alone. He stood at the edge of the valley where Eliza had confronted him, hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "I was wrong," he said. "What I did to you and Rosemary, it was wrong. I was scared and selfish, and I convinced myself it was the only way. But it wasn't. I made a choice, and it was the wrong one." He finally looked up, his eyes wet. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I know, and that I'm sorry." Eliza studied him for a long moment. This man who had sent her to die, who had haunted her nightmares for years, who had forced her to become something she never would have become otherwise. Then she did something that surprised them both. She embraced him. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "Holding on to that pain would have killed me more surely than the cold ever could. Go home, Uncle Vernon. Live well. That's all any of us can do." The years that followed brought changes to the valley, but never changes to its essential character. Eliza married a young man named Thomas Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants who had come to Montana for the railroad and stayed to farm. He was a quiet man, good with numbers and machinery, and together they expanded the geothermal systems until the valley produced more food per acre than any farm in the state. Rosemary married Samuel Crowfeather's grandson, and their children grew up speaking both English and Blackfoot, bridges between worlds that had once been enemies. Samuel died in 1947, peacefully, in the cabin Eliza had built for him near the Central Springs. He was buried on the ridge overlooking the valley, and every year on the anniversary of his death, the community gathered to honor the man who had helped save 2 lost girls and given them the knowledge to save so many others. By 1960, the Whitmore Valley, as it had become known, was famous throughout the agricultural world. Scientists came to study its geothermal growing techniques. Farmers from across the country wrote letters asking for advice. Universities sent students to learn methods that were now being replicated in geothermal regions worldwide, from Iceland to New Zealand to the volcanic hills of Japan. Through it all, Eliza remained what she had always been: a learner, a builder, a woman who saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles. She wrote 3 books on geothermal agriculture, established a foundation to help abandoned and orphaned children, and trained hundreds of young people in the techniques she had developed. She never forgot where she came from, never lost sight of the frightened 16-year-old who had walked into the wilderness with nothing but a flour sack and a sister's hand to hold. She died on a spring morning in 1998, 81 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the cabin she'd rebuilt with her own hands 60 years earlier. Her last words, according to Rosemary, who was holding her hand, were, "The earth has secrets. We just have to learn to listen." Today, the Whitmore Valley community is home to 37 families and produces over 2 million pounds of food annually. The greenhouses Eliza designed have been updated with modern materials, but they still use the same principles she discovered in that desperate first year. The earth's heat captured and directed. The warmth of the springs turned to purposes of growth and life. The foundation she established has helped over 3,000 children find homes and opportunities, carrying forward her belief that no child should ever be thrown away. And every winter, when the temperature drops below 0 and snow blankets the mountains, the valley stays warm. Steam still rises from the Central Springs. Vegetables still grow in heated beds. Life still flourishes where, by all the rules of nature and logic, it should not. So what can Eliza Whitmore's story teach us? Perhaps it's this: the circumstances that seem designed to destroy us are sometimes the very things that set us free. The traits that make us different, the curiosity, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept what everyone says is impossible. These are not flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be cultivated. And the warmth we seek is often already there, beneath our feet, waiting only for someone brave enough to dig down and find it. When the world throws you out, when the doors close and the cold closes in, remember Eliza and Rosemary walking into the mountains with nothing but each other and a dream. Remember that what looks like the end is sometimes just the beginning. Remember that the earth has secrets for those willing to listen. What secret is waiting for you to discover it? What impossible thing might become possible if you refuse to give up? If this story resonated with you, if you found something in Eliza's journey that speaks to your own struggles and dreams, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most important truth is the simplest. With enough determination, enough love, and enough willingness to learn, even the coldest winter can become a garden. A 16-year-old girl walked into the mountains with her sister, and she built a world where warmth rose from the earth and no one was ever turned away hungry. That's not just a story. That's a possibility, still alive, still waiting, in every heart brave enough to believe it.